Hi guys. So, a little while ago, I put together a little presentation and I thought it was a very well put together presentation, and I thought I want to share that with you guys. So, my topic was on ASD and empathy. So, it's autism spectrum disorder and empathy. So, let's start, shall we? So, when I say autism or just the word autistic, who comes to mind? You probably know someone who is autistic in real life, but what about in the media? I think a lot more people who have less exposure to autism would know more about the depiction of an autistic person in the media. So, um, when I say autistic, did this image comes to mind? Was it Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory? Sean from The Good Doctor, Dr. Sean Murphy. I might have misspelled his name, but we'll move along. Or Joe from The A Word. So I've never actually watched The A Word. It's a British series. So these mainstream depictions of an autistic person might not necessarily be entirely accurate, but it's close to being accurate. Sheldon is more of a comical interpretation of it. Now, as we move along, I want you guys to think about what are your preconceptions of autism? How do you think an autistic person would behave, right? And I just want you to keep that in mind, and we'll talk about it as we move along. So, if for you guys who haven't heard about autism, let's talk about what it is, right? Okay, so what is autism? Autism is a lifelong developmental disability that affects how people perceive the world and interact with others. So, let's break it down, shall we? Lifelong means it doesn't go away. It stays with you from when it's a part of you, right? And developmental means that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder in which it is kind of congenital, I guess, but it shows in your behavior. So, why developmental? It's because we pick it up when an autistic person is still a kid. That's when the sign starts to show, right? Um, and disability means that they have a different way of perceiving the world and interacting with others. So, according to NHS, the two defining characteristic of an autistic person is that one, they have difficulties in interacting with others, and two, they have repetitive behavior, kind of a fixed daily routine that they have to do. It's kind of like OCD, but not as debilitating as OCD. Though I do think that they're not like mutually exclusive. You can be autistic and have OCD. Okay. So another thing about autism is the full name is autism spectrum disorder. Hence, it's a spectrum condition, and every experience is unique to an individual. And what that means is that it's every experience is different to an autistic. Sure, the symptoms might be the same, but the degree to which it affects that person might differ depending on how early of an intervention we give them, the environment itself, parental investment, because and personality, of course, because even as typical neurotypical person, we have different ways of developing because of our background, right? Like how, where do we come from? How much time we spend with our parents, our own personality, so on and so forth. So because autism is mostly a um, behavioral disability, and that does play a lot with your own personality. So it's a spectrum condition, and it is unique to all individuals. So not all autistics are the same, right? Okay. So now let's talk about. Remember when I asked you guys to think about your own preconceptions about autism. So here I'm gonna address some of them. There's not all of them. If you go to the link there, I'm gonna list all my references down below. So if you go to the link there, this is from an Australian website. They would tell you about the common misconception of autism or autistics, and also the facts that are included along with it. So you can have a read, or because I'm not gonna list all of them, there's so much, you can actually do probably another video of it. So common myths about autism or autistics. So first, vaccines cause autism. So this is kind of like, I feel like this is a debate that's still going on. I understand why there are anti-vaxxers, but I just don't understand why they still are anti-vaxxers, because there are no reliable scientific evidence to back this up. Okay, vaccines do not cause autism. I hope none of my listeners believe this. And vaccines depends a lot on herd immunity, so everyone please do your part and get vaccinated so that we can eradicate diseases that have actually been eradicated for like tons of years, or decades after a vaccine is created. Okay, so the second one is that it only affects children. So while we do pick it up when there were children, it doesn't go away. Autistic children do grow up to be autistic adults, so it doesn't only affect children. It's something that you kind of was born with, so it carries with you as you get older. Take an example of something that cannot be changed from since you were birth, like your eye color, for example. Unless you do some weird stuff to your eyes, your eye color probably won't change, right? Even if you put on contacts or anything, it stays with you. Okay, so next is autistics are nonverbal. Okay, so the nonverbal case is probably one of the more extreme cases. I think there are autistics that are nonverbal, but most autistics are verbal. And given early intervention, and what I mean by early intervention is like we actually help them to give more support than you would a normal child in learning verbal skills. They would most definitely be verbal. In fact, some autistics have even higher verbal IQ than their typical peers. So not all of them are nonverbal. I think a lot of factors vary upon how early of an intervention you give, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of factors that play into this. So yeah. Okay, so the ones that's in bold and the one that we're gonna talk about most today is that autistic cannot feel, express, or understand emotions. So this is interesting, right? I feel like because this is like the defining key, one of the defining key traits that can be seen as in autistics, in which they have difficulty in socializing and interacting with other people, and this is due to how hard it is for them to understand emotions. So the thing is, it's not that they can't at all feel, express, or understand. They can feel it, they can express it, they can understand it. It's just that it doesn't come to them as easily as it would to a normal person. They can definitely understand emotion, they can express it, they can feel all of these emotions. Given that you communicate about these emotions directly, they just can't pick up on those subtle cues, right? And etc. And by that I mean, like, there's a lot of others that you can find by yourself. And oh yeah, one of the more popular ones are that autisms are only in boys. So there are autism in girls, it's just that it's seen kind of differently, and I could talk all about that, but this is not what this video is going to be about. Okay, so on the topic of feeling, expressing, and understanding emotions, that is what I would call empathy, right? The ability to put yourself in another person's shoes, to think how they would think, to feel how they feel. So that's what empathy is broken down into. So in the system of empathy, so we're gonna talk about what goes on in our brain when we think about empathy, when we talk about empathy. So you have two components to empathy. One is the cognitive component, where this is involved with the prefrontal cortex and other parts of your brain that are associated with neuroprocessing. And what this means is that you're able to think logically. You're able to think how a person would feel given a certain condition, when they are in a certain condition. So you're able to think about it in a third person perspective. So affective component is really just like a scientific way of saying emotional empathy. So it involves empathy related neural systems like the anterior cingulate cortex and anterior insula. So we're going to see that in a bit. Don't worry about the terms. Just know, I think it's important to know that these are the two systems that are involved in empathy. So yeah, and this means that you're able to literally feel what the other person feels. So there is a study where when a person describes the pain to a listener, the listener can actually feel the pain as shown in brain scans when when we put them under an MRI. I think it's an MRI, not sure. And the parts of the brain that processes pain actually flare up in this listener when he listens to the one who describes the pain, right? So if it is like literally them feeling the pain. So I think that's kind of cool. As you can see, these two systems, they work together to form empathy. So you need to be able to think logically, and you need to be able to feel how the other person would feel. This is how empathy works. So what happens to autistics are they are more intact with cognitive empathy kind of comes more easily to them as compared to affective. I don't think they don't have it altogether, the emotional component of empathy. I think they do, but it's just less pronounced than cognitive. It's just less easier for them to get the emotional part. It's just easier for them to get the cognitive parts. So there's a bit of I think there's a bit of a disconnect between them. It's less connected than it does with other typical people. So knowing how empathy works now, let's look at how psychologists study empathy. So we're going to look at some empathy studies, not all, just how we would study empathy and so on. Okay, empathy studies. So in this paper, you can see that image source. This is from a review paper. It's like I'm not sure if it's a systematic review. It's just a review. So in this one, they had participants to do two tasks. So one is to experience sharing, that is share their experiences. And I would presume that this is involved more in the emotional component of empathy. So this is in a neurotypical person, as a normal person. And the other task they had the participant do is to think about another person's condition. Like how do you feel given a certain condition. So that's what we call mentalizing. So as you can see in this image, the blue parts are mentalizing, and the green parts are the part of the brains that flare up when the person is experience sharing. So you'll see a lot of this abbreviation that might not make sense. Most of it doesn't make sense to me either, to be honest. they did say what it is in the paper, but let's look at the important part. So if you remember, in prefrontal cortex, which is about here, And here, this is like a two-way look at the brain, a two view of the brain. So prefrontal cortex, so this is mentalizing. So this is the part of the brain that's like related to cognitive, right? So this is cognitive empathy, cognitive. So, and green is where the affective part comes in. So ACC is the anterior cingulate cortex, and AI is anterior insula, and this is medial prefrontal cortex. So ACC and AI is part of the ones that processes emotions. I think what's interesting in this one is that you can see that the green and the blue part doesn't really overlap. It's almost like there's the two systems are completely different from each other, but they still kind of work together to form empathy. And I think there's something about that we don't really understand yet, or I haven't really understood yet. I'm not sure if I've read all there is to read because I've only read a few. I'm sure there are a lot more. I wish I have more time to read. Okay, so that is how you can study empathy, but a more popular way of doing it is by doing an emotion recognition task. And how it is you can look at this GIF. I made a GIF from a website based on this video source, which I will link down below. So in this task, how this task work is that you present a face of a person making a certain expression, and then you'll be given a series of words that could describe how this person would feel. So like you have one person's face right here, and choose from a series of words that describe that person's face. So that's how emotion recognition tasks work, ERT, to make it short. And what usually happens is that we usually couple eye tracking with this task. So to say that we can look at where the participants are looking when trying to discern emotions. So so in typical people, they would look at somewhere below the eye region, or the eye region basically, to when discerning emotions, while autistics will look at the mouth region when discerning emotions. And when they compile the data, when they compile the results, it is quite obvious that autistics perform more poorly in this task as compared to typical people. And this kind of study has been replicated by a lot of people, a lot of researchers, and they've always come to this similar conclusion that when that autistics tend to focus on the mouth region when talking to a person, and as such they perform more poorly in emotion recognition tasks. So this is why this is a part of like how we try to figure out why autistics are poor at emotion recognition. And there is something about eye contact, and there are a lot of data to back up how it is important to look at the eye to maintain an eye contact when talking to people in order to understand the other person's emotions better. So the phrase "the eye is the window to a soul" actually has credence to it now, you guys. So idioms are not just idioms. Okay, so the thing about this is that there are still more studies that can be done, and there are still more ways to improve emotion recognition tasks, because one part of it is that we in real life we don't look at static pictures, right? Our mouths are always moving when talking. Everything is always moving, so it might not be an entirely accurate depiction of emotion recognition. But so with as more technologies are being developed, we can definitely improve our emotion recognition task. For example, looking at a video, and stuff like that. So there are also a study where they test autistics with higher verbal IQ, and they found that even when they concentrate on the mouth region, they can still perform better than their autistic peers at emotion recognition. So there's a thing about that, words and eye gaze and everything. And these are important components into socializing. Okay, so I think this is very interesting, right? The all the connections between words and eye gaze and verbal skills, all parts of this that goes into socializing. So you can see how complicated it is to actually socialize. So that is all that I can say about this presentation. It has gone on very long. And it's not really a bite anymore. I don't know why I put it in a bites, but here's a summary of what we've talked about. So, autism spectrum disorder is a lifelong developmental disability. Every experience is unique and different, and autistics are often misunderstood to have no ability in processing emotions. So, there are two systems of empathy, right? So, we talk about cognitive and affective empathy, and often most autistic demonstrate cognitive more than affective. Then there seems to be a disconnect between that. We don't it seems easier for them to do cognitive better. And we talk about studies on empathy. So these are my reference that I will put in the link down below, and I thank all of you for listening.